Hi, my name is Pat, and I am the father of an HLHS kiddo named Micah, who's almost 6 now. So it's been a long journey, and I'm doing a parent review of NPC-QIC's fall learning session. It's a virtual learning session, so if you've never been to an NPC-QIC event, the learning sessions are kind of the big ones. In the past, they were conferences that were held typically in conjunction with the local children's hospital. We were able to go to one in Cincinnati, and they shifted to a model where they were doing half the year virtual and half the year in person, and then COVID hit, so it's been all virtual since then. So it's a full day event, so this review is going to be pretty long, and I'm just going to go over briefly what they covered. If you want to take a look at, the video feeds for everything they covered, and there were sections of the conference, but the learning session that I couldn't be in because it was broken into breakout sections. So at times there were 3 different things going on. I was only able to attend one, but we'll have links to NPC-QIC and where you can see the whole learning session, the recordings of the learning session, as well as sometimes they put up PDFs of the presentations given and how you can get involved, because NPC-QIC is both doctors and parents, and the Fontana Outcomes Network is hopefully going to be trifold, doctors, parents, and patients. So with that, we'll get into it. The first thing I started with was network celebrations. This took place on October 28th, 2021. So the first thing they did was network celebrations. The first was centerline shift. They saw a centerline shift. So in data, this is if you're tracking data of a certain thing, and for this was multidisciplinary care team meeting before stage 1. So before the first stage of surgery, the Norwood typically, and an HLHS kiddo did the whole multidisciplinary team of doctors and surgeons get together to talk about the case before it went into surgery. This was previously at 88.8%, and it shifted to 93.7%. So this was a push by NPC-QIC, and it got better. The next was feed by tube or mouth before stage 1. So children who basically were fed by mouth before their stage 1 surgery, so before the Norwood, so those couple days. For us, it was 8 days with our son Micah. He did not eat by mouth. He was in a coma the entire time. We didn't discover he had HLHS till day 3, and he crashed very hard. He was pretty borderline by day 4, but he bounced back. We did surgery on day 8, but he was intubated and in a coma. But not all children are like that. Many children, they know they've got HLHS before they're born, and they can give them the progesterone to keep the ductus arteriosus open. And so, what they've seen is there seems to be a positive correlation between feeding before the Norwood and feeding after. So they've been pushing that. So that went from 53.4% to 62%. And then fed by mouth in general, that's without the tube, but by mouth, went up from 41.3 to 52.9%. So they wanted to celebrate those centerline shifts, and so very positive things. So there's now 70 care centers involved with NPC-QIC, and that's good because the model of NPC-QIC is a collaborative network, and it's all teach, all learn. So the more teachers and learners you have, the better off you are. There's 2 new big projects in NPC-QIC. One is unplanned reinterventions and pre-op oral feeds, and another big project that's underway that we talked about in the September review was the health equity, which is underway. So get into the next piece. The next presentation was the data audit update. I'm going to cover stuff real briefly because there's just so much there. So the identification of special cause mortality. They identified 3 time frames of interest. And so what they did was they looked at their data for mortality in children with HLHS before the first birthday, and they had identified some time frames in that data set that mortality was significantly higher than the average. And so they identified 3 time frames that they wanted to investigate. Things were worse in those 3 months, but they didn't know why. And they were trying to figure out, is there a single factor or a combination factor? And if either of those are true, if they can find factors that they can point to, would this spur on new projects? And they found 15.8 patients were audited so far with a notice of 36.4 discrepancies, and but only 3.4% discrepancy in individual data points. So it's important to have consistent data. This goes into how inconsistent is the data being reported. So if a center has an HLHS kiddo and they've got a bunch of medical records on them, how consistent are those records to another hospital's? And the reporting into NPC-QIC, the idea is to go from oranges and apples to apples and apples. So you have a clear way to compare things. However, that depends on the reporting, right? So if the orange folks and the apple folks, or apples and oranges to pears, if they're not reporting right, then you don't get pears in the middle. And so that's what they were finding with the data audits. So you had 15.8% patients audited so far with 36% discrepancies. So that's a little over a third of the time you have some kind of discrepancy within the data that was fed into the system. So that can be a little alarming, but what they found is on individual points, it's only a 3% discrepancy. They reinforce the importance to have consistent data, and what they think they're going to do in the future for auditing is they're going to re-audit centers who have higher discrepancy rates at above 2 times the average. So the concept is, if there is a consistently high level of discrepancy reporting from one or more centers, then you need to figure out why. Is it something with the reporting tool? Has there been a trading issue? Is there a problem with the data collection in general? Like, what's causing the discrepancy, and can it be fixed? So, I've got a lot of notes. Next presentation was Parent and Clinician Ignite. That involved a video on biventricular repair from the founder of the Ethan Lindbergh Foundation. For those who don't know, biventricular repair for an HLHS kiddo, the concept is you increase blood flow to the unused side of the heart, and hopefully basically get the left side of the heart functioning at some level. The concept being is it's better to have even a low functioning level left side of your heart than no functioning level left side of your heart, and then maybe over time the left side will grow. I know Texas Memorial Hermann in Houston has a team that is fairly aggressive on that front. I know there's another team, I want to say, in Boston that's also fairly aggressive. We didn't go down that road with my son. My son's hypoplastic left heart syndrome is so severe that he almost doesn't have a left side at all, so he was not a candidate for biventricular repair. But that is one of the questions they brought up, is who is a good candidate? Because the featured family in the video, their son did have a biventricular repair, but then eventually went into heart failure and passed. And so the question becomes, who actually is a good candidate? It's not a solution for everybody. And so their kind of mission was to help right children find the right surgery. And so they formed a foundation, the Ethan Lindbergh Foundation, and that's to provide aid and aid to parents to navigate the decision-making process of, okay, we have a kid with HLHS, so what's the diagnosis? For our child, for Micah, the path was extraordinarily clear because he only had HLHS. He didn't really have any other problems. He had a couple of problems, but not the big heart problems that often come with heart defects. So he had the single major heart defect, and it was severe, and so there really wasn't any other options. Like the 3-course to get you to the Fontana was pretty much it. That's not the case with everybody's kids, as I'm sure you know. Everybody's child is different, And so everybody's path forward is different. And so the Ethan Lindbergh Foundation was kind of formed to help parents kind of figure out the best path forward for their child given the data. So next presentation was data from light and not heat, and it was effectively just a transparency journey explanation for NPC-QIC. The concept being you want to share everything with everybody as much as you can, and that is sometimes very difficult. When you run an organization and you have a lot of stuff, it's hard to make that stuff presentable to the public in general that makes it easy to look at. Like, there's plenty of documentation and stuff that you get as a charity or even as a small organization that just putting it out there in front of an audience, you want to clean up, you want to make it look understandable and presentable, and that gets difficult. But that's ultimately the goal of NPC-QIC, is to be as transparent as they possibly can. And that's, as they're moving along, that's slowly what they're trying to do, to foster the concept of all teach, all learn. And one thing they're very proud of is their ability to sustain their gains even when taking on other projects. So as we talked about in some previous videos, NPC-QIC used to be very focused on just the interstage period between stage 1 and stage 2, which is like your Norwood and your Glenn surgery, although there's other possible things that could be stage 1 and stage 2, but it's called interstage, and it's the high mortality rate typically for the first 10 or so years or more of these kiddos. And so they were very focused on getting the mortality rate down, and they did. They were able to help a lot of centers do that over time, and so the mortality rate has thankfully stayed low, even though they've started to take on other projects. Like, they expanded their regime to birth to first birthday, and even prior to birth, and then the Fontana Outcomes Network is sort of formed to do the after the first birthday. But even when taking on that project, they were still able to see maintenance within the centers of a higher rate of survivability, which is important. It means that what was getting out from NPC-QIC was not just being used in the short term, but it was becoming part of the way these kids were treated in general. And so that was part of the data used for light and not heat. And what that is a term for, data for light and not heat, is you want to use data to help you figure out what a problem is and not to make you angry or to make other people angry. And sometimes you need to get angry in order to spur you on to solve a problem. That's true, but you don't want to make people angry so that they butt heads and stop working on the problem. So that's the concept. That's the concept behind transparency. You want to get the data out so people know it's there and where it is and how to get to it. The next presentation was on predicting outcomes. So predicting outcomes, basically the concept is, if XYZ thing happens within my child's course, then what's going to happen downstream? And what they've set up is it's based on clinical progress and milestones. So, how long did it take them to get extubated? What sort of meds are they on? How much support are they getting? What are their medical dosages? And so they took those concepts, and there's a number of them, and said, okay, given these things, let's do a retrospective data analysis and build a prediction model out of that. And this isn't uncommon in all prediction fields. So I work at a power plant, and one of my prior jobs as an engineer was to do predictive maintenance modeling. And so we used a tool, and we fed data into that prediction tool about like a piece of equipment, so like a pump or a motor or a valve or something, and said, okay, given these parameters, this is where this pump operates, and send an alarm or send us a flag when the operation gets out of these normal operating parameters. And so that's how you build a predictive model. You feed it old data, so retrospective data in this case, and that's you run it through your mathematical model, your mathematical prediction model, and there's lots of different types of those. So some of them are better than others depending on the application. but that produces your prediction. And so what they discovered was that there were some things that were very good predictors on outcomes, and some things that were not. Interestingly enough, the vasoactive infusion score was not helpful. But there were some things that were helpful in prediction, extubation, meds, that kind of stuff, amount of support, and some things that weren't. And so that's sort of, they're just tooling the model now. They're trying to figure out, okay, what things are actually helpful in predicting good outcomes and what things maybe are not, and then we need to exclude from the model. So the next presentation was gross motor development, QI projects, and the unplanned reintervention, QIP. So I attended the gross motor development QI projects. I didn't go to the unplanned reinterventions, so if you want information on that, you'll have to check out the recorded presentation on that one. So here that NPC-QIC uses ASQ for data collection, but rates are low reporting. See if did I actually write down what ASQ stood for? Ages and stages. So ages and stages. So this is gross motor development. So gross motor development is, I mean, almost everything you do, right? There's fine motor development, sort of like writing and typing, but gross motor development is like walking and crawling, and I mean, eating can kind of get in and out of there. But it's sort of the bigger stuff, I guess, the bigger motor skills, the balance and that sort of things. So there's ASQ, which is ages and stages, and there's other ways to test gross motor skills, but this is the one NPC-QIC is using in its database. The problem they're having, they have low rates of reporting. And so they're at 20% of their centers right now. So if you think about that, you get 100 centers, it's only 20 of them reporting. They don't even have 100 centers, they've only got 70, so only 20% of reporting. Their target goal for this project is at least 40%, and their long-term goal is 80%. And what the goal of this project is to get children ASQ screened to kind of predict what their gross motor development is going to be like, and therefore what tools need to be used by the parents and teachers and everybody who's working with the kiddos in order to get them to where they should be, or where another kid who is a heart healthy kid in their situation would be. So this is a big on parent engagement, using tools, reporting, and importance. Basically teaching parents early and often that there is a big picture and there are long-term effects of the time in the hospital. It's not just like you get them home and they're suddenly like a new, like a kid at their development. There are delays, there are developmental delays, and those have to be dealt with maybe differently than you would just a normal kid. And so they're developing tools for how to work gross motor skills into a busy schedule, and they're recognizing particular family barriers. Like some families have that kind of time. Some families, every member of the family works. How do you do gross motor care when everybody's working all the time? And, trying to work it in, okay, you need to do 2 hours of this activity when you don't just do it in a block. You can split it up in 10 minutes a day, and that's better than doing nothing. That sort of stuff. And so they're building these tools with that in mind. And they're working with a primary care team and make sure they understand limitations and importance of gross motor catch-up and what they can do. One of the problems they were seeing is sometimes pediatric care teams who, may have seen one HLHS kiddo in the entirety of their practice, kind of have a tendency to blow off gross motor function as something, oh yeah, they'll catch up with it, don't worry about it. And the reality is there are things they need to work on as they develop in order to catch up, and they can catch up faster. And so that's the other piece of it. It's parents and primary care team. All right, moving on. The next piece was therapy support. So how early do I think this was either a question to the group or this was a question they had asked their centers, the 20% who are reporting, is how early do you do it near stage 1, and what was the frequency. And so how early near stage 1, that's good. That's really where you want to start your gross motor skill stuff, because once they wake up from the coma, effectively after recovery, that's when they need to start doing gross motor stuff. Frequency 3 to 4 times per week was most common, and had a pretty wide variety. So the therapy support, and so therapy support is one of the great tools that gets used to help parents both understand what they're supposed to be doing with the child on a daily basis, and then what they're supposed to advocate for with the primary care team. And so it's important that there's therapy support gets used, and so 1 to 2 times a week, could be good as long as it's very useful, but more times is typically better. The drivers for this project, the gross motor project, it's patient-centered, parent-driven, and being referred to and participated in appropriate therapy. So that's the concept, it's the project centered around the patient, which is the HLHS kiddo, under the age of 1. It's parent-driven, so gross motor stuff has to be driven by the parent. So the parent has to want to engage with this, and then along with the parent, you're referred to and participating in appropriate therapies. So that's the gross motor skill project in a nutshell. And all these projects that I'm mentioning are stuff you can potentially get involved with, either at your local center, if you're the place your child had his surgeries done is a participant with NPC-QIC. They might have a team that you can help with in integrating these kind of practices into how that hospital works. Alternatively, you could reach out to the national NPC-QIC, and we'll have those links at the bottom, and you can try and work with them to be on the learning teams. So the next presentation was the Neonate score case study. So this is Neonate's kind of a big, it's an acronym, Neonate. And so Neonate is about interstage survival and they want to reduce mortality by 46%. It's from 9.5 to 5.1%. And they want to reduce readmissions, and they want to eliminate growth failure. And so the Neonate score is a way to look at patients that come in, and it produces a number. Basically, each of those letters stands for something. Let's see if of course I didn't write it, but I'll have it in below what the Neonate stands for. But Neonate, each of those relates to something. So, breathing or intubations, the medicines are on, the problems that they have, and all of these are predictors for positive or negative outcomes in a kid's immediate future. Typically, whether they go home in the interstage period or whether they stay in the hospital is what these scores more or less try and tell you. It's provided in what's called an interstage change packet, and it provides red flag education for parents, and it coordinates discharge planning. So the neonate scores to help get better from, we've lowered mortality so far on the interstage period. We want to lower mortality even more, and so make survivability even better. Neonate score is effectively attempting to show in numbers the odds of making it to stage 2, depending on the issues that children have had in the interstage period. So it's built off case studies, and it's effectively used for discharge planning. Do we discharge the child to go home between stages, or do they stay in the hospital? We went home with our son in the interstage period. We were readmitted twice, one for like a week and the other for like a day and a half, and then we went back in for the Glen. We had another family there who had their kiddo at the same time. It was, basically same day as us almost. and they stayed in the hospital for the between the interstage period, so over those like 3 or 4 months. And so it just depends, what's the best solution, and are they still on air, going home, are they, what's their feeding regimen, are they eating, or is it all by tube? There's a number of different factors, and the neonate score tries to take all those factors and put them to a number and say, if the number's below this, then they're okay to go home, and the number's above this, better keep them in the hospital. That's the idea behind it. It's not nearly as cut and dry. And so what they did was they put out a number of case studies, and they used the neonate score, and they sort of walked through the study and said, okay, here's what the score would have told us, and here's what people would have sent them home or not sent them home, and here's what happened with the case and that kind of thing. And so that's the neonate score sort of being built out of previous case studies. So that was the neonate score. It was really, really, really very interesting, but somewhat technical, really technical, especially when they got into the case studies and they were just rattling off, the child had this stat and that stat and that stat, and it's a little hard to follow in some places, but it was interesting to see, some doctors arguing, no, we would have sent this kid home, or no, we would have kept this kid in the hospital. So it was very clear that there is not a broad agreement on some of these factors and their importance, and so it was good to see this project moving forward. The next was social determinant of health, and does it affect use of neonate and discharge planning? Social determinant of health, so it's sort of like, social determinant would be like, how far do you live from the hospital? What's your household gross income? What sort of insurance do you have? That sort of stuff. And that stuff does not really play into the neonate score, but it does affect discharge planning. It really does, especially when you're talking about kids who live way, way far from the hospital. We live in Texas, and we knew some families who were, 6 hours away from the hospital we were at, because Texas is really big like that. You get out of the western states where everybody's really spread out, you can have some children who live far, far away from their hospitals. And so that doesn't necessarily factor into the neonate score, but it should factor into discharge planning. So next presentation was on emotional health and resilience. And so that's an invitation to what's called Roadmap College. So this is NPC-QIC responding to an effort with the American Board of Pediatrics. It's a 6 to 8 month improvement effort, and there's 44 interested teams around the network, the 70 hospital network. So it's a roadmap project, and the goal is to help improve emotional health of patients with congenital diseases. And effectively what we've seen is both the emotional health of the patients and the families in general is typically, I'm trying to remember, less than average is a way to put it. But it's not, children are less likely to be what's called neurotypical, who have CHDs, and the families around them typically have social or have emotional issues as well. Not surprising. There's a whole lot of stress, and stress is very clearly an underlying factor and problem of every problem everybody has. So that piece of it has caused a real push from parents and even now clinicians to try and look at emotional health. And so the project, what they want to do is develop several tools and test them within the centers, and building on online modules for use. And the Roadmap College, 6 to 8 month, it's a webinar series. And so effectively what's going to be done, the American Board of Pediatrics is going to build this webinar series. It's going to run for 6 to 8 months, and it's going to be supplied to NPC-QIC centers to support emotional health of children and families with chronic conditions. So the idea being, we'll provide you the information about what we found about emotional health and resilience among families who have complex issues. Then you guys can use that to build tools to help the families deal with the emotional response and impact of having a child with a complex congenital heart defect, and build resilience into the family and the child. The next presentation is submitting a research proposal, and it was effectively a walkthrough of how to submit and start a research proposal with NPC-QIC. So I'm not going to go over that because you can go to the website and get that and listen to the recording, but effectively that's what it is. So the next presentation was Socioeconomic Impact on Outcomes in the First Year of Life. So this is kind of a let's see, it's a lead on from the health equity. So the health equity project was a primary piece of the September webinar. This is kind of a sub-piece of that. So they looked at SDOH, which are social determinants of health, and it's a retrospective analysis of the NPC-QIC database. So they're taking the various social determinants of health and looking backwards through the data they already have in the database. From that, there's a development of what's called a deprivation index, or DI, and it produces a number 0 to 1 based on the zip code versus 6 SDOH factors. And these aren't developed by NPC-QIC. This is something NPC-QIC is using from somebody else's research project, but they came up with six SDOH factors that are used in determining social determinants of health, and they produce so a 0 score would be you have the least number of social determinants of health problems, and the 1 would be you have the most. You have a lot of issues that can get in the way of obtaining and using healthcare. So I think the assumption of everybody going into this would be that on the lower end of the scale, closer to 0, people that have more social determinant of health factors would have more problems with outcomes. They would have worse health outcomes, because that's what we saw in a lot of the data back in September. What they actually found, though, was that median range DI results in higher mortality. And this was a little surprising. There isn't necessarily a reason given for this, but one of the possibilities provided was that it might be because people who are on the far end, obviously people who are on the high end, are able to obtain the health care they need through their, blessings. And people on the low end are easily identified as needing help, and so are much more likely to get help within the systems that are designed to help them. But the people in the median range are neither helped by any blessings, nor are they identified as needing help, and so they end up having the highest mortality rate. This was surprising to me, and it was surprising to everybody else. That's just one possibility for what's causing that data to look that way, so we'll see. They're going to do further research, but that's the primary belief right now, is they believe the mid-range folks, because they're not as supported in the SDOH, or the social determinants of health arena, that may be why they have a higher mortality rate. So the next presentation was positive predictions for all oral feed by first birthday. So the concept being, can we come up with metrics to tell us that a child is going to be able to feed themselves, or at least take everything by mouth by the first birthday? So non-tube fed, non-NG tube, non-G tube, no nothing, just eating everything by mouth. One of the factors they looked at was preoperative feeding, and that seems to be both safe. So preoperative would be before first stage, so feeding before first stage. We talked about the centerline shifts at the beginning of this, where everybody was shifting towards feeding more before first stage. The data shows that, number one, that appears to be safe. It doesn't affect outcomes with the surgeries, and it seems to support later oral feeds. However, interestingly enough, that factor did not show significant benefit to reaching tube feeding freedom. And so while it might support later oral feeds, it doesn't show being all oral fed. by first birthday. For instance, when my son was had his G button, so he was a G tube, he was eating some by mouth and some was being pumped into him. It did, however, seem to shorten time to reach full feeds, and it shortened hospital stays. So good on some fronts, feeding, preoperative feeding before the first stage, but not necessarily for the goal, which is all the world feed by first birthday. The next presentation was techniques for parent engagement. So that's y'all. It's hopefully all the parents who are listening to this. So they're basically talking to their centers about how to engage y'all, because the reality is one of the primary ways NPC-QIC gets better is through parental engagement, and that primarily is supposed to happen at the center level. So you're supposed to be working with your center on NPC-QIC QI projects, quality improvement projects. So, care improvement for kiddos, using your experiences to help the families that come after you, more or less. Some things of note talked about in the presentation: parental involvement has been important in the past. They're seeing a downward trend in parental involvement, and they want to spur on more. So they're seeing a downward trend of parental involvement within the centers. They want the centers to get more involved with the parents. The other problem is they're seeing kind of the same sort of people always showing up at the centers, and basically it's the folks who are available, right? So a parent who's very busy and can't get involved much with these organizations is not going to. And so only parents who effectively have lots of free time, or maybe even enough free time, and also enough emotional health support, are able to do that, which means you have a somewhat undiverse population of people who are helping NPC-QIC centers. So they provided some kind of thoughts to the centers and say, if you can, reach out to other patients and families who are not just the ones who volunteer, but all of them. Make sure you kind of throw a wide net, especially if you're looking to improve things in certain areas with certain groups. And this, hopefully, the diversification will provide different views, which will lead to different projects that better serve the population the hospital serves. They want the centers or the hospitals to ask for feedback from parents and to ask for help, basically. They did a couple of case studies, or they showcased a couple of case studies to the centers on what can drive parents away from helping. So accusing parents of things, so that can drive parents away. Obviously, I don't really feel like getting accused of my doctors of doing bad stuff or not thinking of my child, so that would easily drive me away. I can see that. And then assuming they have same access to technology as most doctors. So most doctors are highly technical folks these days. They have access to lots of technology. Not every parent is like that, obviously. And so there's an assumption that some doctors and nurses and groups make that the parents are going to have the same access to technology they do. And the reality is they need to design projects to help people get involved even if they don't have the same access. So some other notes try and include underrepresented groups, state the importance of having parents and diverse, create testimonials to help them convince parents, and provide technology as needed. So all that said, if you're a parent listening to this, it means your center if your center is an NPC-QIC center, they've just been told by NPC-QIC, hey, you need to get more parents involved. So if you're thinking about getting involved, this is a really good time to strike while the iron's hot. So, and I highly recommend getting involved. So, and it doesn't matter how old your kid is. One of the parents at the NPC-QIC meeting, her child was 10 years old, 10-year-old HLHS. She'd never been involved. She'd never come to NPC-QIC thing. She'd only just gotten involved recently, and that's fine. We want everybody. We want everybody to be involved at any level. Like, really, all I do is go to the meetings and provide comments. You can get involved in a lot of ways at your own center in driving improvement for HLHS kiddos. basically for the future families. And then the last presentation was a Fontana Outcome Network update, so FON update. So the goal of FON is to optimize longevity and life of Fontan patients. So if your child is basically past 4 or 5, they probably have a Fontan circulation setup. And so the Fontana Outcomes Network was more or less developed for them. It's sort of a corollary to the NPC-QIC network, the idea being that you want to drive quality improvement within care for children and adults who have the Fontan circulation. So they're in the process of developing the registry and their QI science. They also want to make sure when they build this, they can provide the data to other collaboratives, because there's a number of collaboratives out there, PAC3 and Cardiac Networks United come up for me, but there's several other cardiac networks and collaboratives out there. So their goal is to launch with 12 pilot sites this fall, so it's going to be 12 sites. So like I said before, NPC-QIC has 70 sites, 70 hospitals. FON so far is going to start with 12, but hopefully it's going to expand from there. And from the data registry they build and the sites who are involved, they're going to start identifying care practice projects. So the idea being is, what is the optimal care path for a person who has Fontan? And then this is going to be a whole person, right? So it's just medication and doctor visits and whatnot, but also like diet and exercise, and like what are all the things that result in a better Fontan circulation down the line. Like, and so, it helps with the liver problems, helps with the classic bronchitis, helps with all the other issues that can come up with a Fontan kid. So really, really excited by that personally, partly because the Micah Mason Foundation is founded to sort of drive research into what comes next. And so this is definitely up our alley. So that was the last presentation I gave. I know it's kind of a whirlwind. I know it took me a really long time, but it's 40 some odd minutes of what was an roughly 8-hour day sitting in front of the Zoom meetings. And they don't take breaks. I had to take breaks, so I missed a little bit of it. They don't take breaks. They just go like 2 10-minute breaks within that whole day. But it was like 10 to 5. It's not 8 hours, it's 7 hours. Either way. So if you want more detail on any or all of that, go to NPC-QIC's website. And that's going to be down below, as well as our website, the Micah Mason Foundation. And there's a message from me coming up about a capital campaign we've got going right now. And so we appreciate your support, and thanks for watching. I'm Pat. We are all in this together.